Metropolitics. I'm very glad the title is up there so I can remember it in its entirety. Critical theory, collectivity, and the right to the city. David is a principal lecturer at Westminster University and one of the editors of the journal Radical Philosophy, which is actually available in the shop downstairs.
Excellent.
Yes, there's the plug. But also David Cunnigham...
We're £10,000 in debt, so the more of you can buy, the better.
Conducted a very interesting interview with Rem Koolhaas, which is in the current edition. And as that would suggest, David has a kind of long-standing interest in architecture and urbanism and critical theory and theories of the avant-garde and the relationships between those things. And it's really in that context that I've asked him to come and join us and speak to us tonight about his kind of take on the current state of urban theory. Ladies and gentlemen, David Cunnigham.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug, and thanks for the invitation to come and speak here, which is a real honour and a pleasure, particularly as Doug very politely mentioned. I'm not either an architect or by profession an architectural theorist or historian. My own background is in philosophy and critical theory, and I say this partly to excuse the high level of theoretical abstraction in what I'm going to talk about, although at least part of my argument will be that it is no more abstract than the kinds of social forms that it relates to. In a sense, this is framed as a paper about architectural politics, but in a way, it's really just laying the ground for a discussion of architectural politics. I'm very aware that at the end, I never quite get to a proper discussion about architectural politics. It's rather contextualizing what it might mean to talk about architectural politics today. And after a small introduction, the essay, the paper has 4 parts related broadly to this long subtitle. The first part on the right to the city, and then a second part which is a kind of brief sketch of the relationship of architecture to politics. Third, a longer section on this idea of metropolitics and its relation to specifically social as well as cultural forms of abstraction. And then finally, a kind of coda on contemporary political context of architecture. I have some images, but I'm not really going to talk about them, so they're just there to entertain you visually as I go along. Okay. In the wake of a century, which was, against the expectations of Karl Marx and others, for the most part an age not of urban revolutions, but of epochal rural uprisings and peasant-based wars of national liberation, there has over the last few years been a marked resurgence of interest among left-wing theorists in the question of how we can conceive today what a recent world charter drawn up at the Social Forum of the Americas posits as the potential of the urban. Hence, for example, while self-styled Nouveau Leninist Slavoj Žižek suggests that, quote, the new forms of social awareness that emerge from slum collectives of the global south will be the germs of the future, Italian post-autonomist Antonio Negri has tentatively posited the internally antagonistic spatial configuration of the advanced metropolis as that which might extend and replace the privileged place once accorded to the industrial factory as the crucial site of contemporary social production, cooperation, and conflict. Determined as such examples may be by our contemporary culture of academic left celebrity, a culture of academic left celebrity that was in full force at Birkbeck over the weekend, each reflects the degree to which the remarkable global reality of contemporary urbanization has thus given new life to Marx's own belief, expressed in the 1848 manifesto, that what he called enormous cities might constitute one key condition of both a spatial concentration and a social collectivity in which some new social class's strength could grow and it could, quote, feel that strength more. In this paper, I want then to begin an attempt to contextualize, its scarcely answer, the question of what this might mean for a thinking of a possible politics of architecture. This is a question that will in turn be framed here by 3 extremely general propositions. First, all questions of a specifically modern architectural politics turn around a transformation of the architectural itself that has its origins in the 19th century. What Beatrice Colomina, get this right, says of Adolf Loos, that the subject of his architecture is the citizen of the metropolis immersed in its abstract relations, is true in far more general terms and with an increasingly planetary scope. Modern architecture is a constitutively urban phenomenon. Indeed, it is what in 1848 Marx himself describes as the historical increase in the urban population as opposed to the rural, which is the always implicit subject of modern architecture, and its relation to it, in relation to which it must irresistibly articulate itself. More fundamentally, it is indicative of a far broader and increasingly universal dialectic of the architectonic object and the urban that comes to redefine the meaning of the architectural as such over the course of the modern era. Today, as we know, this apparently goes beyond the bounded space of the individual urban agglomeration to embrace a logic of urbanization on a global scale, hence raising the question of architecture's role within the formation of a now increasingly virtual metropolitan space for which the network is one persistent conceptual figure. My second proposition then, if architecture's specifically modern identity cannot be disentangled from this ineliminable engagement with and subjection to the forms of the metropolis, this may well make it appear as, at one level, immediately political in its practical effects, insofar as it necessarily intersects with what I take to be the contemporary terrain defined by the basic question of politics itself. That is, what are the current possibilities for collective transformation of the social, and under what conditions do they operate? To talk of architectural politics in its strongest sense is thus, as the history of the avant-garde makes clear, to talk about the ways in which architectural practice and knowledge relate to or mediate and are reciprocally mediated by such current possibilities. Third and finally, if, as I would thus assert, contemporary politics is itself irreducibly urban, the revolution has to be urban or nothing at all, as one celebrated urban theorist has recently put it. It is so in a sense that constitutively transcends its classical determination as that which belongs to the polis. As such, my more polemical claim will be that many recent attempts to theorize and imagine such a new urban politics have been dramatically limited by virtue of an anachronistic recourse to spatial and philosophical models of the city in efforts to articulate emergent, real, or speculative forms of political collectivity today. Seductive as is the idea of a renewal of urban politics as, in the words of the geographer Eric Swindergau, a recentering of the space of the polis, conceived in the idealized Greek sense as the site for public political encounter and democratic negotiation, the spacing of often radical dissent and disagreement, and the place where political subjectivation takes place. Nonetheless, it will be my central presupposition here that it is in fact precisely a recognition of its distance from the urban form of the city as polis that is the condition of any adequate theoretical engagement with the modern urban problematic. It is from its historical capacity to mark such a recognition that the concept of the metropolis, in particular, derives its specific theoretical importance, not least in architectural discourse. To rephrase the above, a contemporary urban politics must be a metropolitics or nothing at all. At least initially, and some of these issues might well find a focus in a consideration of the currently ubiquitous concept of what is termed a right to the city. Originally the title of an essay by the philosopher and urban theorist Henri Lefebvres, first published in Paris in the iconic year of 1968, the discursive legacy of this concept is certainly remarkable. Most recently, in urban theory itself, it has provided the title for another already influential essay, published in the British journal New Left Review by the geographer David Harvey, from which I want to take my starting point. The right to the city, writes Harvey, is far more than the individual liberty to access urban resources. It is a right to change ourselves by changing the city. It is, moreover, a common rather than individual right, since this transformation inevitably depends upon the exercise of a collective power to reshape the processes of urbanization, end quote. It is this latter point that entails two immediate questions. First, what are the contemporary forms and conditions of the necessarily collective power upon which this right thus necessarily depends? And second, in light of this, what is or might be the political or legal form of these apparently new claims made by urban actors who, as another figure often cited in these debates, Saskia Sassin puts it, struggle for recognition and entitlement. For Lefebvre himself, writing in 68, quote, in the most positive of terms, it signifies the rights of citizens and city dwellers and of groups they, on the basis of social relations, constitute, to appear on all the networks and circuits of communication, information and exchange. The right to the city legitimates the refusal to allow oneself to be removed from urban reality by discriminatory and segregative organisation, end quote. I've quoted Lefebvre at some length here because I want to draw attention to a certain ambiguity within, or at least double-sided character of, this articulation of the right to the city itself. On the one hand, this presents itself in the form of a resistance to removal from an already existing urban reality. As Harvey notes, the Paris Commune, a constant reference point for Lefebvre's own accounts of urban politics, was itself, quote, wrought in part out of a nostalgia for the world that Haussmann had destroyed, and the desire to take back the city on the part of those dispossessed by his works. And certainly while contemporary discourses of the commons have tended to focus on, for example, the activities of biotechnology and commodification of the natural world, today is perhaps above all the urban that constitutes the primary space of so-called primitive accumulation, that is, accumulation by dispossession, within the current regimes of global capitalism. In a metropolis like Beijing alone, some 3 million people have been dispossessed of the spaces they previously occupied in recent years. And for obvious reasons, such developments have been productive of, for example, a whole range of grassroots forces of resistance to so-called slum clearances in both the so-called developing and developed world that have often taken the right to the city as a central battle cry. No one, I take it, would want to deny the importance of these forms of activism, nor their potential to constitute a collective power that might otherwise remain unrealized and fragmented. The problem, however, is the degree to which this has today become the dominant form of understanding the right to the city itself. In doing so, it occludes what is in fact the primarily futural tense of Lefebvre's formulation, the right to change ourselves by changing the city. For as Lefebvre himself asserts in the 1968 essay, if the right to the urban is to constitute more than, quote, a simple visiting right or a return to traditional cities, it can only be formulated as a transformed and renewed right to urban life as such, where what is at stake is the possibility to construct new, quote, places of simultaneity and encounters, places where exchange would not go through exchange value. As he continues, if it is true that the words and concepts city, urban, space correspond to a global reality, the right to the city refers to the globality thus aimed at. In the contemporary lingo, then, this is less a commons which is to be preserved or defended in the face of new waves of urban enclosures than it is to be produced. And it is precisely this political horizon of the global as the condition of its futural dynamic that constitutes, then, I want to argue, must be taken to be the contemporary right to the urban's fundamentally metropolitan shape. I'll return to this point in a moment, but let me first offer a rather brief consideration of what I think some of this might thus mean for the contemporary conditions of architectural thought. In doing so, I want to return, initially at least, to an earlier 20th century conjuncture. And as such, I will begin with a familiar citation from Walter Benjamin, one which I quote in a sense precisely because of this very familiarity. In the work of Art in the Age of Technological Reproducibility, Benjamin sets out the socio-historical conditions for what he describes as a new art based on politics. These conditions are not only technological, at least in a limited sense, but relate to what Benjamin describes as the increasing significance of the masses in contemporary life. He's, of course, thinking here of film, but the laws of its reception, which are accorded a revolutionary significance by Benjamin in their foreshadowing of emergent modes of collective intercourse in society as a whole, are nonetheless themselves prefigured elsewhere. For it is at this point that Benjamin introduces a now famous comparison. The collective activity of the distracted mass, Benjamin writes, finds its prototype with regard to buildings. Buildings, quote, have been man's companions since primeval times. Many art forms have developed and perished, but the need for human shelter is lasting. Architecture has never been idle. Its history is more ancient than that of any other art, and its claims to being a living force has significance in every attempt to comprehend the relationship of the masses to art. It should be acknowledged that there are some problems with Benjamin's argument in this passage that are all too often passed over. In particular, there is a tension here between the effectively trans-historical significance accorded to building as man's constant companion, a kind of natural historical prosthesis derived from the need for shelter, and the more specifically modern conditions of architecture's relation to the masses, a notion which relies upon a proposition concerning the formation of some particular new urban collectivity in which quantitative expansion is transmuted into qualitative social change. At the same time, Benjamin implicitly draws here upon what is in itself a distinctively modern conception of architecture as, first and foremost, the production of a social space, a conception which can, in part at least, be thought alongside, for example, early 20th century debates concerning functionalism. For as Adrian Forty notes, until the end of the 19th century, a term such as function was a term primarily relating architecturally to the tectonics of building, to the action of a building's own mechanical forces upon its architectural form. It is in fact only in the first decades of the 20th century that a new use of the term function became more widespread, one in which buildings themselves were described as acting upon social material. For avant-gardists like the German G group in the 1920s, the concept of functionality thus served to disturb a whole previously existing conception of architectural aesthetics, in which aesthetic space becomes living space, as Benet puts it in his 1926 book, The Modern Functional Building, and as such constitutes an entirely new form of architecture's embedding in the social sphere. For the historical avant-gardes in particular, then, it is architecture's formation as an art or techniques of social space that automatically rendered its impact potentially political, and at the same time formed the glue for its conjoining with wider forces of actual revolutionary politics, with, that is, what Harvey terms a collective power to reshape the process of urbanization. It is this fundamentally futural conception that connects it to Lefebvre's original conception of the right to the city, as well as to his situationist contemporaries. And it is equally why, of all the arts, architecture alone came to appear, for many in the 20th century, capable of rendering art's work directly political, precisely by virtue of its constitutively urban character. As Frederick Kiesler puts it in the 1930s, the change of architectural spacing to urbanism in creating new possibilities creates a new society. A view also exemplified in, for example, the manifestos of the German artist Soviet, who, in allying themselves with the revolutionary ambitions of the workers' and soldiers' urban Soviets in 1918, assert the necessity of, quote, a great architecture as the condition of a more general politicization at a mass scale. So the distinctively modern conception of architectural construction as a form of social construction is then the historical precondition of Benjamin's own more subtly politicized conception of architecture as a kind of physiological extension of the bodily collective, which may precipitate and be precipitated by new social forms. Moreover, and more generally, it cuts across later divisions of modernist and avant-garde architecture, embracing both what Benjamin terms the new barbarism of Corbusier, Hilbersheimer, or the early Mies, and the expressionist activism of Bruno Taut's self-consciously utopian projects. No doubt this is all fairly familiar material, but I reiterate it in order to make two key points. First, it is the supposed failure of such hopes for architecture as the creator of new forms that will of course come to seem metonymic at its most extreme, because most apparently practicable point, of the general failure of the avant-garde, that is, as the desire to bring together political and artistic practice in the post-war era. Unable to reflect upon the social conditions of its own ideological status and the division of labour sustaining it, architecture is itself, so Manfredo Tafuri famously writes, obliged to return to pure architecture, to form without utopia. Yet, and here is my second point, whatever one makes of this all too familiar narrative, one is obliged to recognise too that its real lesson is that the possibility of any putative politics of architecture has thus always been itself reliant upon the intersection of its constitutively modern urban condition with emergent collective social forces in the modern metropolis itself. Whether or not we agree with his historical analysis, it is in these terms that we have to take seriously Peter Berger's critical interrogation of, for example, the hopes of those in May 1968 who believed, he writes, without a social basis, that they could build directly on the experiences of the early Russian avant-gardes. It is thus with the apparent dissipation of renewed post-war urban struggles in the advanced capitalist metropolis, under the synecdochic name of May 68, that a certain familiar account of the neo-avant-garde, brandishing as banners the fragments of utopia they cannot confront head-on, as Tafuri characteristically puts it, will become more or less absolute in both architectural and art historical discourse. Benjamin's citation of architecture as the prototype for a modern art based on politics, precipitating and precipitated by an emergent proletarian public sphere, becomes instead Frederick Jameson's more ambiguous account of architecture's emblematic significance as residing not so much in its directly political character, but in what he terms its simple immediacy to the social, in the seam it shares with the economic. Let me return now to my initial set of questions. If we accept with Lefebvre then, that by virtue of its very socio-spatial form, the characteristic of the urban as a space of encounter allows differences to flourish and generates the contemporary conditions for creative human communities, if nothing else as a progressively global reality, this compels us to ask the basic question of how today a demand for a right to such a potential might be made practically by the power of new collectivities themselves to reshape the processes of urbanization. In part, this is of course a problem broached by that most fashionable of contemporary concepts, that of the multitude. Not insignificantly, I think, its greatest proponent, Antonio Negri, has, as I noted at the beginning of this paper, recently turned towards the antagonistic spatial configuration of the metropolis as that which might occupy a privileged place in the multitude's, quote, construction of new circuits of communication and new forms of social collaboration. Here, as with Lefebvre's articulation of what he calls an emergent differential space, the question is, so Negri writes, if the metropolis is invested by the capitalist relations of valorization and exploitation, how can we grasp inside it the antagonism of the metropolitan multitude? Like Benjamin's emphasis on the specifically urban conditions of the potentially revolutionary significance of the increasing significance of the masses in contemporary life, Negri's turn to the metropolis here takes its cue, of course, from Marx himself. Specifically, it builds upon the implicit claim in Marx's account of the great 19th century increase in the urban population that politically, as against the rural fragmentation of a peasant class, a new class of revolutionary workers is precisely constituted by the ways in which, in the words of Guy Debord, published a year prior to Lefebvre's essay, they are dangerously brought together by urban conditions of production. Yet if this presents the metropolis from the perspective of the class composition of the proletariat, the metropolis needs also to be apprehended from the side of capital itself, and in particular from the perspective of that form of socialization inherent in the exchange value form itself, and of its concomitant production of a certain form of space. As such, it is in this light that the questions raised by the contemporary demand for a right to the urban might well be productively placed into dialogue with one of Lefebvre's other most influential concepts, the concept of abstract space, insofar it is this concept which names the dominant spatial form of production of capitalist modernity in general. For a dominant tradition of politico-juridical analysis, of course, a certain abstraction is intrinsic to the social and cultural formation of modernity more generally. The emergence of a distinctively modern concept of citizenship, such as that invoked in Lefebvre's own reference to the rights of citizens and city dwellers, is thus, for such a tradition, precisely conditional on its opposition to the ancient, more or less mythical model of the polis, structured by concrete and particular communal affiliations. It thereby has as its corollary the formation of an entirely new culture of abstraction, with the abstract individual and his or her set of abstract rights at its center. Nowhere in Lefebvre's account of abstract space is the work of George Simmel mentioned, but there is then, I want to suggest in this sense, an obvious point of proximity here to the concerns of the latter's famous 1903 essay on the metropolis. For Simmel, crucially, the concept of the metropolis appears historically not as a simple synonym for the city or polis, but on the contrary as the manifestation of a distinctively modern productive logic of abstraction which opposes and unsettles it. Set in motion by industrial urban capitalism, the conceptual and historical specificity of the metropolis is thus precisely formed in Simmel by its negation of the existing form of the city, via its tendential elimination of the specific values of places and of their incomparability. Now, Simmel, of course, is not an unfamiliar reference point in discussions of architectural modernity, from Tafuri through to Anthony Vidler, Michael Hayes, and others. Yet in more recent accounts, a kind of impressionistic typology of urban phenomena, the blasé type, urbane intellectualism, and so on, has in fact often tended to occlude the essential determination of the specific logic of abstraction that underlies such phenomenon in Simmel's text. That is, their intrinsic connection above all to the money form. The metropolis, Simmel writes, is the seat of and is dominated by the money economy, in which it is money, quote, with all its colourlessness and indifference, which becomes the common denominator of all values. Irreparably, it hollows out the core of things. The metropolis would thus be, for Simmel, the historically specific, generalised spatial formation of a certain reality of abstract forms, the spatial correlate primarily of monetary exchanges, general mediation, and production of the social. I'm drawing here, of course, more upon Marx than upon Simmel himself, and in particular upon the crucial notion of a real abstraction to be found within the former's work, though such a notion seems to me at least implicit in the latter's, that is, in Simmel's text. At any rate, in both Marx and Simmel, it is precisely the actuality of social abstraction that is thus identified as a specific historical difference of both capitalism and the metropolis as modes of production and of urban form. Abstraction, that is neither merely a mystification nor a structure of illusion, but a social, historical, and trans-individual phenomenon, which, inasmuch as it has a very real existence, takes on a paradoxical concreteness and materiality. I stress this because if the historical specificity of the metropolis is to be defined primarily in terms of its status as that which is dominated by the money economy, it is thus important to recognise that this is not only a question of it providing something like the necessary primary space in which monetary exchange takes place. More than this, the metropolis must also be understood to designate the potentially universal processes by which both built and social spaces are themselves produced by universal exchange. If money is the dominant modern form of the abstraction of social relations or contemporary experience, then the metropolis is not only its backdrop or setting, but is its socio-spatial equivalent or correlate. This thus relates not only to what Jameson describes as the translation of the money form back onto space itself, via capitalism's unique power to, quote, seize upon a landscape and flatten it out, reorganize it in a grid of identical parcels, and expose it to the dynamic of a market that now reorganizes space in terms of an identical value. It also means that a certain abstract form of social relationality itself would in this sense simply be abstract space real content, condition of a new urban logic of social connectivity and being in common, a common content that is not pre-given, simple abstraction out of what is there, but which is rather itself a kind of productive instantiation of this abstract form. It's perhaps worth unpacking this a bit. The argument here rests on the count in the much later Marx of the idea of real abstraction, which in itself marks a shift in Marx's own understanding of abstraction from his earlier works. In the earlier works, abstraction tends to appear as a kind of mystification or as a kind of structure of illusion. In Capital in particular, abstraction appears as that which is itself real. In other words, it has an actual existence, and therefore it can no longer be thought of that which masks something more real or concrete beneath it, but which becomes itself the kind of basis of social relations in Capital, which also means in that sense that it is a productive force. You know, it produces new kinds of social relations, which are these abstract relations, and those are the real relations of advanced capitalist life. You know, they're not the mask of somehow realer or more concrete relations which exist between them. You know, in a sense, this should be obvious today when we think about what we're doing when we're on the internet and where we are and what happens when we make financial transactions and so on. Those, in many ways, are our real social relations. You know, those are the real things. We live and die by those social relations. It's not as if they mask something more concrete and practical and everyday underneath it. This is a problem, a real problem, I think, at least with the reception of Lefebvre's thought. Lefebvre himself is a bit ambiguous about this, but the reception of Lefebvre's thought, so in architectural discourse, has often tended to view abstract space as precisely something like a mystification, in other words, something like the earlier Marxist conception of it, rather than the very reality of modern space and social relations. And I think politically, if nothing else, this makes an enormous difference how we think about abstraction in this way. It's also apparent in a lot of contemporary architectural and urban, more general cultural theory discourses about something like the everyday, you know, which presumes that the everyday is somehow a space of reality and concreteness and practicality, which I think Marx's account of real abstraction, and indeed Zimmel's account of the metropolis, is precisely intended to question. In other words, the everyday is itself a space of abstraction, abstract social relation. That is our everyday life in advanced capitalist societies. Now, 2 points should be made with regard to this. First, if the ongoing unfolding of this global urban problematic continues to develop under the hegemony of capital, we are nonetheless obliged to recognize that such hegemony is never in itself total or complete. Capitalism is not reducible to the sole logics of accumulation of capital, nor to the specific abstraction of the value form. It is always articulated with other non-capitalist social forms and relations. Indeed, it cannot reproduce itself without them, even if it must in turn reconstitute them in new ways. Equally, and for the same basic reasons, this is not essentially a process of homogenization. In fact, contemporary urbanization relies upon a certain immanent generation of difference, internal to the production of what Lefebvre calls abstract space itself, insofar as it must also spatially instantiate, crucially through political means, those economic relations of difference essential to the accumulation of value. In this sense, what Mike Davis terms a planet of slums is as much an outcome of this process as are Sassen's global cities. Planet of slums, of course, is on the left of the global cities as represented by a rather wonderful Barclaycard advert is represented on the right. Nonetheless, in this context, any consideration of contemporary urban politics is bound to be complex, not only insofar as, like the financial system, the urban process itself is, at one level, as David Harvey rightly notes, now global in scope, but also because it is indeed increasingly abstract in its form. It is this that, by its very nature, connects the metropolis to that space of the accumulation of value, the world market, which has, as Marx pointed out, always been tendentially global in form. In the famous words of the 1848 manifesto that more or less precede its section on the city, quote, "It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. In place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction." This is something in the manifesto, incidentally, that Marx attributes to the bourgeoisie, but it's more obviously attributed to capital itself. What nestles everywhere and settles everywhere and establishes connections everywhere is less the bourgeoisie as a particular historical class than it is simply the social form, I think, of capital. Significantly today, the emergence of this new spatiality itself increasingly appears to assume a kind of extended metropolitan form. Hence, for example, Deleuze and Guattari's suggestion in Thousand Plateaus that, quote, "If it is the modern nation state that gives capitalism its models of realization, what is thus realized is an independent worldwide axiomatic that is like a single city or megalopolis, a suggestion which in turn rests upon a definition of the urban as that which in its metropolitan form, quote, exists only as a function of circulation and circuits, of the connective network that is mediated by pure exchangeability." Now, on the one hand, as Saskia Sassen argues, the emergence of what she calls this new geography of global processes could in itself, no doubt, provide an opening for the articulation of new forms of citizenship, whereby, quote, "the denationalizing of urban space and the formation of new claims by international actors raises anew the perennial question, whose city is it?" Yet, and this is what I want to emphasize, it also raises some particularly difficult questions about our very contemporary capacity to imagine properly collective political forms that could, even speculatively, operate at the same level of social universality of the independent worldwide axiomatic that is the real abstraction of the value form. In other words, if there is a form of universal socialization, of course in reality there isn't really no absolutely universal form of social relationality, but if there is, or the closest thing there exists to it globally, it is capital itself, it is the value form itself. The question is whether one can imagine alternate forms of socialization to those established and produced by the exchange value form, as it were. And the key point here, in a sense, is that, as against, I think, a certain reduction of this, we do need to think about exchange value and the value form as themselves forms of sociality. In other words, they're not simply economic forms in a basic sense. They are the forms in which, in global capitalism, what it means to be social are structured. In other words, in the simple sense of how everybody relates to everybody else and how we might begin to do that globally is dominantly structured by the value form. In that sense, it's as much a social form as it is a strictly economic form. Now, this is, it seems to me, then, precisely the political question, indeed the question of the possibility of an urban politics today. If the right to the urban takes the speculative form of a globality that is aimed at, as Lefebvre puts it, in the words of Harvey, quote, unlike the fiscal system, the urban and peri-urban social movements of opposition, of which there are many around the world, are for the moment not tightly coupled. Indeed, most have no connection to each other, end quote. Indeed, this can be seen as part of a more or less deliberate policy on the part of current economic and political regimes. The construction of a world in which the neoliberal ethic of intense possessive individualism and its cognate of political withdrawal from collective forms of action becomes the template for human socialization itself, fortified by the proliferation of newly privatized public spaces and the IMF and World Bank-driven retreat of the state. Yet if the emergence of this fundamentally global urban problematic is, barring global environmental catastrophe, strictly irreversible, as Lefebvre suggests, this also surely raises the question of whether abstraction itself can be thought so easily as what should be speculatively overcome in contemporary struggles for a collective right to the urban. For the real question today might be organized not around an opposition of abstract to differential space, such as Lefebvre suggests, but rather around the question of whether it is possible to conceive of an alternate relationship between difference and abstraction than that constituted by the value form. If nothing else, I want to suggest modern urban developments demand then that a very received opposition between the abstract and concrete needs rethinking at this point, as does a certain still hegemonic political discourse that rests upon it. For in actuality, abstract space is itself a positive site of the production of experience, constitutive of new concrete forms of spatial relationality, which are generative of social meaning. It is not simply, as is implied in much reception of Lefebvre's work, a mere representational form of conceptual masking or misrecognition of some underlying content of a more real, multiple, and concrete lived experience. Lefebvre himself, I think this is partly a problem in the way in which Lefebvre tends to exemplify abstract space through things like Cartesianism. But by doing so, it makes it appear that abstract space is simply a kind of representational form imposed upon something that's actually real and fluid and messy and bodily and concrete. I don't think that can possibly be the point about abstract space. Abstract space, even by Lefebvre's own account, has to be seen as itself a positive, not merely a kind of negative form. It produces new kinds of social experience and new kinds of relationships. Indeed, is it not precisely as lived experience that we most obviously inhabit abstraction today, which means that the humanist or vitalist search for some more real and concrete praxis buried beneath the forms of contemporary capitalism would only occlude the historical specificity of those forms themselves that derive social cohesion from the reality of abstraction and abstract connectivity. If the contemporary political question, as framed by the slogan of a right to the urban, is then whether it is possible to conceive of equally universal forms of global social mediation and exchange to those established by that actual form of universality, which is the value form. And if it is the very abstractness of the value form that is the condition of that universality's actuality, this must beg the question of whether any competing or alternate form of equal universality, and thus collective power, would not have to be equally abstract also. It was a very long sentence. I should break that up into bits. The point then is, if in a global context, as Lefebvre frames it, the right to the city has to aim at what he calls a globality, if it has to raise the possibility of whether we can conceive of forms of socialization, forms of the universalization of socialization, that would operate at the same scale as the value form, as manifested through global capitalism. And if the capacity of the value form to operate at such a scale is precisely because of its abstraction, in other words, it's only by virtue of the fact that it is abstract in the way which it is that allows it to be global, in the ways in which it is, then I think it has to raise politically the question of whether any competing form, whatever that might look like, might not have to be equally abstract. Yeah? So in other words, the presupposition, which is very strong in Marxist, humanist, and indeed many other forms of politics, that is the concrete that constitutes kind of real politics and what has to be searched for, seems to me, at the beginning of the 21st century, an increasingly dubious proposition. In other words, it seems to be hard to imagine how one would constitute a collective power opposed to and different to capital that was not as abstract as capital itself, albeit in a radically different form, of course. For is it in fact possible to imagine some form of urban social connectivity that would not involve fundamental forms of abstraction? In which case the simple criticism of abstraction per se, rather than of the historically specific forms of violence that it generates under certain conditions, would make little sense here. Indeed, it would operate as a profound block on any plausible contemporary metropolitan politics of emancipation and transformation. Notwithstanding what I take to be its broader problems, as opposed to current models of politics constituted around a melancholic retreat, as opposed to current models of politics constituted around a melancholic retreat into a faith in singular and precarious acts of democracy that scarcely bother the surface of contemporary capitalist reality at all. That's a quote from Jacques Rancière. Recent accounts of the multitude at least have the merit of an attempt to engage the unfolding dynamic of this problem of real abstraction. In the work of a theorist like Paulo Verno in particular, we can find a unique attempt to identify, as one commentator puts it, a historical transformation within the modalities of abstraction itself. To quote Verno, quote, because it organizes the productive process and the life world, what Marx calls in the Grundrisse the general intellect is indeed an abstraction, but it is a real abstraction endowed with a material and operative character. This notion of the general intellect, which has become a very prevalent notion in a lot of radical Italian thought since the 1980s, is derived from Marx's book preceding Capital, the Grundrisse. And it refers essentially to the idea that as work or labor becomes itself more and more intellectual, it constitutes a kind of mass or general intellect, almost something like a kind of collective but immaterial brain in some sense, that is being at least partially built through contemporary modes of production. In some ways farcical illustration of this, as it might be, one might think about something like Wikipedia. You know, the Wikipedia is a kind of vulgarized manifestation of the general intellect in some ways, Verno's terms. In other words, it's something that's built from a kind of mass intellectuality through cooperation and collaboration between the various individuals anonymously constructing something like Wikipedia. This argument, however, about the general intellect relies tendentiously upon a characteristically workerist or autonomist privileging of labour over capital that finds in contemporary forms of cooperative production a spurious transcendence of what Verno terms the principle of equivalence embodied in the money form. In this, it reasserts Panzieri's and Tronti's claims in the 1960s and 1970s for the primacy of living labour and collective workers' cooperation as the true surplus of capitalist production, only then secondarily captured by the capitalist regime and driving the transformations of that production itself. This is an argument that you get in Verno and Negri and others that goes back to an argument first made in the late 1960s in the context of radical Italian thought and politics. The argument being that instead of seeing what happened to workers' movements in the post-war period as a failure of those movements and as a kind of a simple victory of capitalism, what people like theorists like Panzieri and Tronti tried to argue was that in fact everything that changed in capitalism in the post-war period was itself the result of, was driven by the struggles of workers. You know, so it's the struggles of workers that drive capitalism to transform itself in the way in which it does. It's not simply capitalism working and then the workers are kind of co-opted into that process. The ramifications of this argument then were that in some sense there was a primacy of labour with regard to capital. So So that what was really developing in society were new forms of cooperation, new forms of collaboration that were really constituted by the working class, or what they call living labour itself, and which then, secondarily, are captured and put to work and distorted in various ways by capitalism. Yeah. In Verno, Negri, Maurizio Lazzarato and others, and it was more recent developments of this theory, the general intellect extends this claim further into an attempted politicization then of abstraction itself, in which what is posited is the emergence of a real abstraction beyond the commodity form, to be uncovered in the collective power of the cognitive and intellectual cooperation within a multitude. As the production of a new commons, the social notoriously re-emerges here as the space of what Verno describes as a virtual communism, which is, in the words of Lazzarato, not formed or created by capitalism, but which the latter simply takes on board and adapts. Now, this is, I should explain this a bit more contextually, I think. This is not an argument I have to say I agree with as such, but what interests me about it in terms of the form of the argument is that what I think Verno in particular is trying to do is he's trying to constitute an idea of a kind of collective power, to use that phrase that Harvey uses, that would be itself a kind of form of abstraction, which would oppose, as it were, the forms of abstraction to be found in capitalism. So on the one hand, you have capitalist real abstraction, which is formed around the money form, the commodity, exchange value. On the other hand, you have the abstraction of what Verno calls the general intellect. In other words, the extraction of kind of intellectual work that becomes more and more abstract and more about forms of cooperation and collaboration itself. It seems to be a kind of interesting but wrong argument. Wrong because of the problematic primacy it places upon labour itself. In other words, it seems to me empirically, shall we say, dubious that labour has the kind of primacy that Verno, following people like Tronti and Panzieri in the 60s and 70s, argue. Negri's recent turn then to the question of the metropolis and the series of seminars he's been running on this theme at the International College of Philosophy in Paris must thus be understood in terms of the search for a certain spatial and social analogue of a more properly cognitive, capitalist, deterritorialized and delocalized sphere of communication and cooperation. Hence, to quote Negri at some length, the foundations of life in the city, its vital structures are knowledge, communication and language. The pleasure of being in the city, the pleasure of living there, its wealth is this, a wealth of language, of expression, of effective relationships and networks. Capitalist accumulation today is based upon the accumulation of the pleasure of living together. Exploitation is no longer a matter of capturing 2 additional hours of labour from the individual worker, but instead the power to capture the communication taking place in the great space of the city. And the larger the space, the larger the accumulation will be. The city is thus defined by continual metropolitization. This is one of the ways in which capital asserts its power today, faced with the impossibility of maintaining it with respect to specific factories and determinate relationships. In other words, what Negri is arguing as a further development of this line of argument that goes back to the 60s and 70s is that, in a sense, the kind of life of the city or the life of the metropolis itself is about these networks of communications, these kind of abstract networks of communications. And again, secondarily, capitalism seeks to capture these networks and turn them to the purpose of making profit, to turn them into surplus value in some way. In this regard, Negri, like Verno, has the merit, at least then, of indicating one futurally oriented sense in which the promotion of abstraction specifically allows for spatial integration, temporal compression, and transmissibility in a way not permitted by more concrete forms of knowledge and labour. In other words, these networks of communication and collaboration are only possible on the condition of a certain level of abstraction. In other words, they are fundamentally metropolitan rather than, as it were, contingently metropolitan. Yet for all this, it seems to me, much recent attempts to substantialise the promise of the multitude in the work of Negri in particular have in fact been stymied by what still appears tied to an idea of difference and collectivity that would, in its effective attempt to bypass the productive logics of the money form itself, continue ultimately to lie somehow beyond the central forms of contemporary social abstraction as grounded in the money form itself. In other words, the problem I have with this argument, seductive as it is in some ways, is that it seems to seek to simply bypass the problem of the kind of productivity of the real forms of abstraction in capitalism itself. In other words, it rests in a sense on a kind of hazarding of the fact that these forms of abstraction somehow really are constituted by the multitude or the proletariat, even though we can't apparently see it, as it were. It seems to me that that's pretty dubious. It seems to be much more logical that they are produced by capital itself fundamentally. In other words, the active agent in this is above all capital. It is above all precisely the money form, as indeed Zimmel argues in this sense against Negri. Whatever one's view on this, though, if it is indeed the right to a transformed and renewed urban life, and to the collective power to construct new places of simultaneity and encounters that stands at stake here, we can at least say that this must be seen as conditional, not on a nostalgia, then, for the supposed immediacy of the politics of the polis and its various architectural and urbanist analogues, but on a capacity to think the possibility of new kinds of relation between individual and collective subjectivity and the development of abstract social forms, which is necessarily opened up by any postulation of rights themselves. Part of what interests me in the notion of a right to the city is it's hard to see how a right here as a right is not necessarily in some sense an abstract right, so that it becomes a question of thinking, well, what is the condition of that form of abstraction if it isn't going to be sucked back into the kind of analogues of capitalist forms of real abstraction in contemporary international law and so on. Only here then might we begin to glimpse the lineaments of a metropolitics adequate to those forms of social struggle produced by contemporary urban accumulation and dispossession, and to that demand for the right to the urban which compels us today. Okay. I've titled this a Coda rather than part 3, rather than part 4, so you don't expect too much from it. In concluding, after a fashion, let me return then to the terrain of architecture. In his essay, Functionalism Today, Theodor Adorno writes, quote, "Architectural work is conditioned by a social antagonism over which the greatest architecture has no power. The same society which developed human productive energies to unimaginable proportions has chained them to conditions of production imposed upon them." As Adorno continues, it is in terms of such a contradiction that, quote, "architectonic questions collide with social questions, such as the existence or non-existence of a collective social subject," end quote. For much of the post-war period, in the advanced capitalist West at least, it has no doubt then been the apparent lack of such a political historical subject, largely taken for granted by the avant-gardes of the late 19th and early 20th century, that thus affects what must be understood as the potential social character of architecture itself and as a whole. Retrospectively, what was once known, for example, as postmodernism would seem now in part to have been a displacement of this problem. Marx writes in Capital, quote, "What distinguishes the worst architect from the best of these is that the architect not only effects a change of form in the materials of nature, he also realizes his own purposes in those materials," end quote. As its increasing integration with computational technology and production increasingly integrates architecture at a more fundamental level with new forms of what Lazzarato terms immaterial labor, one could easily imagine Marx's phrasing here being rephrased in a more directly collective form in terms of an emergent form of cooperation or the general intellect. In his 2007 presentation on Rem Koolhaas's writings, Negri thus suggests that the task for the architect today is, quote, "to decide how to interpret the relation between inclusion and disjuncture, the productive relation that extends between metropolis and multitude. Will it be possible," Negri asks, "to open up the chance for encounter and struggles in the metropolis? In the framework of the general intellect, perhaps we only need to start talking about communism and democracy again," end quote. Yet against this final drift into political idealism, perhaps we only need to start talking about communism and democracy again, the logic of capital would suggest, in fact, that within the historically specific forms of advanced capitalism, the subject of such a social purpose, as Marx describes, and part of the architect, is not humanity, let alone the individual architect, but quite simply the actual idealism of capital itself. In the current conjuncture, it is the value form in the shape of money, neither the proletariat nor the multitude, that for the moment constitutes what Marx calls the self-moving substance, which is subject of capitalism, the real basis of contemporary social relationality. In this case, it is Jameson seen with the economic, rather than politics in any emphatic sense, that comes progressively to constitute an immediacy to the social itself, and which would constitute any dominant contemporary instantiation of architecture as an art of social space. As Jameson points out, in one sense, no human society has ever been so collective in its structures as this one. Architecture's changing relations to such collectivity remain an open question and possibility. However, if it is privileged here, it is by virtue of the long history of its own engagement with abstraction, from Luce to Hilbersheimer and Mies, from Archizoom and Superstudio to Koolhaas's Delirious New York and the typical plan, in its capacity to recognize the degree to which such a shift marks a historical transformation in the very relations between the social and political themselves in our contemporary capitalist culture. Thank you.
Right, thanks very much, David. So, actually, I have to use this. To start off with an observation, and you can tell me whether I'm picking this up right or not. When you were talking about Lefebvre and also the notion of real abstraction, is it, you know the phrase, which you will know about, beneath the pavement, the beach?
Yeah.
Are we referring here to the fact that there is no beach and there is just a pavement, and so that's what we need to work with, or is that horribly crude reference to?
Gosh, what an interesting question. Yes, I suppose so, in a sense. I suppose so. But then, of course, there is a beach underneath the pavement.
Right.
In a way, it's to do with what's insinuated by that phrase, rather than reality in that phrase, which is that somehow beneath what we would think of as the kind of the manifestations of abstraction in the contemporary metropolis, somehow hide kind of more real forms.
Right.
Situationism is kind of an interesting one in that sense that I think it hesitates, like Lefebvre himself, between two different understandings of abstraction in that way. And you can see it also in the different kind of temporalities of situationism around its own understanding of something like the right to the city. So on the one hand, there's an almost nostalgic side, I think, undoubtedly, to situationist understandings of the right to the city, which is all about, preserving the lost districts of Les Halles or something.
Yes. Yeah.
But then on the other hand, there is this kind of sense, in relation to like the spectacle, there is always that ambiguity about whether you're simply removing the spectacle or whether you're trying, in some sense, through the spectacle to arrive at some otherwise impossible society.
Which they were in some of their practice in terms of détournement, subversion,
and I mean,
and so forth.
And if he's not, I know he has a tangential relationship to situationism more generally, but if you think about something like Constant, architecturally, Constant's a clear example. I mean, what could be more abstract than New Babylon?
Yes.
In a sense, it's the very model of abstract space, but it's an abstract space that, in utopian form, is constituted differently. So it's constituted by play rather than by exchange value.
Right.
But it's very abstract.
Yeah. I've got some other questions, I think. But yes.
Yeah. Well, I think it's certainly not a nostalgic idea. I mean, I think it's explicitly presented as a kind of futural idea in Lefebvre. It's what's to come. And in Lefebvre, in a sense, not unlike Negri and the Autonomists, and indeed not unlike the early Marx. And what I think is the merit of this, is that he sees it as coming through, in some sense, the forms of capitalism. In other words, there's a definite argument in Lefebvre that had there been no capitalism, there would be, in a sense, no differential space. Yeah, in the same way that, I think, the reading of Marx's manifesto would have to be, had there been no capitalism, there would be no communism for Marx. In other words, the very possibility of some future communism was reliant upon going through what it is that capitalism does. And in that sense, I think the same is true for abstract space and differential space. In other words, it's only through capitalism's institution of abstract space, and via that, the production of what I would call the modern metropolis, although it's not a term particularly that Lefebvre uses, that something like differential space then becomes possible. In other words, these new, more and more complicated spaces of encounter and simultaneity and transaction and so on, that, again, more or less utopianistically, he wants to see as somehow displacing the dominance of exchange value. So absolutely, it's a kind of future, even a kind of avant-garde in the broadest sense, kind of conception in Lefebvre. I think the issue with it is whether Lefebvre conceives of differential space in some sense as a kind of return to concreteness. And I think that's ambiguous in Lefebvre, but there are certainly moments in Lefebvre where Lefebvre seems to suggest that differential space is somehow the kind of return to real, concrete human relations. And lovely as that idea is, I think it's deeply problematic. That somehow through the modern metropolis one returns to something that looks a lot more like the polis, in some sense. A kind of cleaned up polis without the slavery, as it were. Well, I think you just have to think about what we spend most of our everyday life doing. I'm slightly bemused by the idea that you go to everyday life and it's somehow this kind of concrete and practical and dense kind of or non-abstract kind of space. I mean, most of us spend our everyday lives listening to CDs and iPods and being on the internet and making monetary exchanges and talking to people on the phone and taking airplanes and going on holiday. And, I mean, all of these are essentially inhabiting forms of abstraction. I mean, it seems to be that lived experiencing, this is what's unique about capitalism, is that lived experience, everyday experience, in other words, is itself, inextricably linked with forms of abstraction. So I think politically there's something very odd about the kind of idea that seems to develop that somehow everyday life is this sphere of concreteness and materiality that's somehow kind of missing from this other life, whatever that is. I'm always a bit confused about what this other life is anyway, I have to say, but I mean, I think, if we presume that other life is lived in kind of spaces of work or in, in analysis of the avant-garde, the art gallery or something like that, I'm not sure why we imagine everyday life in capitalist societies, at least, is somehow a space of concreteness. Does that make sense? I mean, it's also the problem, of course, with the idea of a kind of dissolution into everyday life. Because given that our everyday life for most of us in this room is a capitalist life, I'm unclear on why one would want to dissolve purely into everyday life in that way. Which seems to have become a kind of standard trope in a lot of kind of art and architectural and urban discourse, that we need to get to everyday life. I find that a peculiar idea. Yeah, I wouldn't want to deny that, and certainly, I mean, in terms of the analysis of it, I mean, if we're talking about the kind of longer standing debates of should we only look at high art and Mies van der Rohe, or should we study the forms of everyday culture, then of course, absolutely. I think it's a question more about what those forms themselves are. Now, I mean, granted, of course, in societies which are less obviously advanced capitalist societies, that level of abstraction may not be the same. It doesn't take such an obviously metropolitan form, although I do think that's changing. And I think I still need a way to think through this more clearly, but it does seem to me there's been this huge growth. If in the 90s everyone was talking about global cities, now everyone's talking about slums. And if there's been this turn towards thinking about kind of slums and third world cities and so on, I'm not sure that they're necessarily kind of less abstract in some way, or indeed less part of that kind of metropolitan construction by the money form. There's a great phrase the Brazilian critic Roberto Schwartz uses, where he's talking about the novel of City of God. So he's talking about this kind of everyday life in the kind of slums as it's mediated by the original novel rather than the film. And he ends the article by saying, these are monetary subjects with no cash, which seems to me a really interesting kind of idea. That in a sense you're mediated by the social relations of money, but you don't actually have any money, or you have very little money. And that does seem to me increasingly the kind of condition of a globalized metropolitan form, that in a sense is as true, at least on one level, of Lagos or Sao Paulo as it is of London or New York or Tokyo. Okay, yeah. That's an interesting question.
Rather than a kind of opposition which comes up something far more quietly aggressive.
Yeah. That's a very interesting question. Maybe the simple answer is force of habit. I don't know. I mean, maybe that's the political tradition in which I suppose that I tend to think. Yeah, I mean, yes, okay, there is an interesting idea around refusal. I suppose that the point would have to be that it would itself have to be a kind of collective refusal. And I think the problems I have is in working out how that would constitute a form of collectivity today, and what. And I suppose there is also a part of it that thinks of the kind of practical difficulties of refusal. I mean, how far can you refuse to cooperate? I mean, this all seems to be an interesting issue around something like kind of, this fetishization of cooperation in people like Lazzarato and Verno, because, I mean, although they do, mention it in passing, they do, I think, clearly underestimate the degree to which cooperation is compelled, as it were, in contemporary, we have no choice but to cooperate on some level. But then I suppose that begs the question of, practically how far collectively is it possible to refuse in that sense, because one could clearly refuse to the point of death, as it were. But there is I'll have to think about that. I mean, there is something very interesting about that, because obviously indifference is itself a kind of modality of abstraction, and obviously one could take a very different line out of Simmel's account of the modern metropolis around indifference, which after is what the kind of blasé type is supposed to be a kind of version of, that abstraction is also not only a kind of indifference to content in the sense of the kind of form of exchange value. So exchange value is indifferent to the contents of that which it exchanges in its pure form, but is also a kind of existential indifference. And also, yeah. Well, I certainly don't want to suggest a kind of moralistic version of this at all. And I think to be fair to kind of Lazzarato and Negri and Verno, they're not they're not wishing to be moralistic in that kind of sense. Yeah, I'll have to think about refusal and indifference. That's an interesting point. Yeah.
Press a little bit on this point because it seems to me that the way that you play with abstraction, which is absolutely what I agree with, this idea that abstraction cannot be treated by and reserved to the subject of Greek, but actually with a different abstraction. The question then is where do you position yourself in terms of your truth, as in if we accept something like Nazis or but use the understanding that there's no other sign that it exists and everything is capital. But then where will this abstraction go? And indeed
That's the question, Andreas. Yes.
and then I wonder whether one can play this idea of indifference, but not just indifference. I mean, you can go back to this concept of Lefebvres, which is not very developed, the country of abstraction, and I wonder whether one can actually see this as a way of fragmentation within space. So you could go back to fragmentation, which may take the form of indifference, but may also take all sorts of other negative forms, which precisely
Yeah.
can never be organized in collective action, and that's
Well, yeah, okay, but that's the problem for me. I mean, yes, I don't disagree with you, and in a sense it seems to me, and I suppose if I was thinking about something like an architectural politics, which I promised and then didn't really, then I suppose I would still take probably a kind of Tafurian position on this in a sense, which is, that in the current circumstances such as they are, in the absence of some positive conception of that collectivity, then a kind of, some kind of process of negativity is probably the best to be hoped for, the proliferation of kind of modes of negativity. I think the problem, again, and it goes back to the question before about difference, is how, if one was going to think beyond that kind of proliferation of fragmented forms of negativity, you would constitute some more kind of positive collective form. And I leave open the question of whether that's possible. I think right now probably it's not, but in a way it's simply setting out the conditions for what form, in very basic sense, that might have to take as against what I take to be more kind of dominant attempts to theorize contemporary politics in these terms. I mean, it seems to me there are a number of different versions of contemporary politics, and you referred to ones here. I mean, on the one hand, you have the boundless optimism stuff is a kind of Negri and Werner, less so maybe of Werner, but Negri and Lazzarato and others, which sees all this as really kind of happening, and we just kind of, we just need to let it happen in a sense. I mean, I find, if a version of this kind of refusal were to be a kind of Badiou or Rancierian one, I find that profoundly dissatisfying, indeed, really quite politically disturbing as a kind of development, that there is an attraction to the kind of conception of politics that's set out in contemporary French philosophers like Badiou and Rancière, which seems to me a kind of weird melancholia for all its supposed reinvention of politics, which ends up as really being about these kind of skirmishes on the kind of edge of reality, and that's kind of it. Democracy in Rancière is just simply these kind of like little kind of skirmishes. Fine, that's not a politics as far as I'm concerned. That's skirmishes. And I suppose in that sense I have a relatively conventional 19th century definition of politics, which is that politics is the collective power to effect social transformation. It seems to me any other understanding of politics in its strong sense is not really politics. It's an analog of politics. It's the political, if you like, but it's not politics.
If I understood correctly, you were kind of depicting these nostalgic reactions to global capitalism as kind of like, hold on, these guys are bargaining at the wrong tree, right? Or kind of like not really understanding or grasping the level of abstraction should be required. But, I mean, like since 1 or 2 years ago, there are certain solutions that seem to be kind of like already obsolete in terms of managing certain international relations, the issue of nation or the concepts of nation that suddenly become once again extremely useful or kind of like I mean, it seemed that they were totally pointless a while ago, and nowadays they aren't, right? Banks are being nationalized, and suddenly everybody starts to look at Gordon Brown against, hold on guys, we better put together saying that that kind of like larger scale level of abstraction that was global capitalism wasn't that anymore, or it's not that it's not that sort of global anymore, and suddenly levels of abstraction that had smaller scales suddenly become relevant and need to be considered once again.
I don't.
I don't know if I put the question
Yeah,
right,
no,
suddenly it seems that all this issue of
Yeah.
global capitalism was global for a while, but doesn't work at all.
I think I disagree with that. I think I disagree with your presupposition. I don't think that's likely to be the effect of the current crisis. And I think, because I think what you're likely to see. I mean, I think what it does reveal, and I perhaps don't incorporate this enough in the way in which I tend to describe this, is that these do fundamentally involve political forms. It's not just a kind of economic process as that process of kind of socialization. There are political forms and maneuvers involved in this. I mean, someone like David Harvey is very good on this in his kind of longer accounts of neoliberalism. One always wants to be wary of any kind of slip into something like a conspiracy theory where a bunch of men in a room kind of get around and say, well, this is what we're going to do. But there is undoubtedly a sense in which something like kind of neoliberalism from the kind of late 70s was designed up to a point. I mean, I think there's a limit to how far it can be designed, but it was designed, and I did say that at one point in the paper. And it seems to me that ultimately, although there's a kind of rhetoric of nation states again that emerges in this, I doubt that actually that's what's going to come out of it. It seems to me that what you'll get is a kind of new international political forms that will be established to kind of deal with this crisis. The inverse part of the question is, of course, nations never went away. I mean, and of course, there is a kind of hyperbolic rhetoric of kind of globalization where everything's, nations and cultures and everything's kind of gone. And of course, that's not true either. I mean, that's a kind of fantasy of the universalization of capital, that it is nothing other than this kind of smooth global space. And of course, it isn't. It's the changing conditions, I think, is to do with how within that global system more local or state forms are reconfigured by virtue of that system. They don't disappear, but I think they are reconfigured by that system. And it may well be that the current crisis will reconfigure them in new ways also, but I don't think it's likely, and I'm guessing, of course, but I don't think it's likely to return to some kind of, like pre-1989 style kind of divided political societies in that way.
Okay. You'll forgive me if I kind of push you a bit more on architecture, given the context, and especially given that I'm looking, as we all are, at OMA Rem Koolhaas's CCTV in Beijing.
Yes.
And so the question I'm going to push you on is can architecture intervene, or architects intervene in any sense in this other than just to kind of perpetuate capitalism and its appropriation of collectivity?
I knew someone was going to ask me that question. I think it depends on what you mean by intervene. I mean, it does. It depends on what you mean by intervene, on what level you intervene at, isn't it? I mean, because, much like kind of actual politics, as it were, we not want to deny the power and importance of kind of local forms of collective action, and that includes kind of local forms of kind of architectural politics, which might, as it were, kind of network themselves into particular local forms of collective power, not only today, but through the history of the 20th century. I really wouldn't want the kind of the ramifications of my argument to be seen as kind of dismissing those kind of forms, and in a sense, as kind of local forms, they're not somehow obliged to think at the kind of level of the universal. I think someone who's struggling against someone trying to knock their home down with a bulldozer in South Africa has enough to worry about without worrying about the kind of universal of the dough, politically. And I think, in terms of architecture, then clearly there are things that architects can do. I would think, you're the architect, you need to tell me in a way, that can do to intervene locally in certain situations and to connect themselves to particular local forms of collective power.
Yes.
You know, I think that's undoubtedly true, and that's always been undoubtedly true. I think,
you know, I raise it because it is, you know, for architects, it comes up as a questions like, well, you know, is the possibility only to go and join OMA and engage in these sort of enterprises,
well,
or just to kind of look at what's going on around the world and see the things we like and applaud them?
I would defend OMA up to a point.
Right.
Maybe I'd defend OMA up to a literal historical point about 1999. I don't know. Let's like that. It might be. I mean, I think, because in a way that's the choice, isn't it? And it can easily be presented in terms of the choice about celebrity, which of course it is partly a chart about, you know, being a celebrity and being a star architect and what that involved. But there is also a choice in that in which clearly, you know, Koolhaas made a decision at some point, as it were, you know, that he was going to surf those famous waves, you know, and that's what he was going to do. And so the criteria of that is then what critical knowledge is produced by that surfing, in a sense, you know. So I think in part, something like OMA and the more recent developments kind of AMO as this kind of research wing, as it were, stand or fall on that kind of sense of, you know, well, what critical knowledge has one gained of the ways in which capitalism works, and particularly its impacts upon the urban and built environment, that we would not have gained were it not for that work. Yeah,
no, I agree. As we have discussed in other contexts, you know, this is, you know, Koolhaas's work is a very kind of sophisticated engagement with the types of cooperation and general intellect that are described in the Italian and post-autonomist school. So that's kind of what I was thinking of with this particular example.
I think there's an open question about whether he's doing that anymore. I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you could certainly see Koolhaas from the kind of 70s through to the 90s as kind of doing that. It's not clear to me in the more recent work whether he's actually doing that anymore, or whether he's increasingly, or OMA has increasingly transformed into another producer of kind of iconic buildings, essentially, which is a kind of slightly different issue, I think. I still think, on the other hand, that I would want to, there's a certain part of me that would always want to defend Koolhaas in relation to a kind of another model of star architecture, which would be a kind of instantiation of that kind of, particularly kind of aestheticized instantiation of refusal, as it were, you know, that is, that I think you find in, how unfair is it to say, someone like Libeskind. I don't think it's unfair in someone like Libeskind, you know. Interesting as the Jewish Museum is in many ways, you know. I think, you know, thinking of what Libeskind did afterwards, there is a kind of aestheticizing of that refusal and that disjuncture from capital that I think there's a certain way in which I think I'd want to defend that over that, as it were, you know. Problematic as that is.
To be continued. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you.